Who did you vote for president?
Mr. Trump.
Right?
Trump. Mr. Trump.
If the election were today, Frank, would you vote for Donald Trump?
No way.
Couldn't happen.
No.
You voted for President Trump. So now, in this moment, you say you're in a free fall. What is your message to him?
So I'm off the Trump train. Where I'm going for now is I got to protect my business.
Island, a wheat farmer.
2022 has been a year of inflation, major supply chain disruptions, high gas prices, and grocery prices up 11% from last year.
You tell yourself, I'm an adult, supposed to take care of myself, I have children. We work every day, people just don't make enough. Thank you.
All Americans have felt the pinch, but there's a region of the country.
Prices and supply chain problems. Americans are seeing increasing costs for food, energy, and housing.
New data from overseas shows imports into the U.S. are down since the tariff war started, while exports to other countries are quickly climbing.
This means major powers such as China and India are finding other markets for their products. Madeline Rivera.
5 million pounds of green beans that we have destroyed, 8 million pounds of cabbage that we've destroyed. We have to grind it up back into the ground. That's the only choice we have and hope for a better day.
Paul Allen isn't alone. Farmers across the country are just...
Why didn't you continue buying soybeans and the other products? They had one word. Guess what it was? Biden.
Biden. Oh, that sounds like malarkey.
Maybe because it is, in fact, malarkey. See, soybean farmers in states across the Midwest are struggling right now because China typically buys more than half of all of
18 Farm Bill are set to expire. It has been extended twice, but that would mean that many farmers won't see any federal dollars until President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill kicks in late next year. And this is happening at the same time that many U.S. farmers are warning that they are reaching a breaking point as unpredictable weather, rising costs, and fallout from Trump's tariffs are impacting their
harvest soybeans as we speak. And right now, 25% of our market is completely missing. That is a 5-alarm fire for our industry.
If you talk to America's farmers, they'll tell you these are tough times. A combination of high operating costs, low commodity prices, and lost markets has had devastating repercussions on the agriculture industry and the communities built around it. CBS's Lana Zak is in Davenport, Iowa tonight with new details on the growing crisis.
5 million pounds of green beans that we have destroyed, 8 million pounds of cabbage that we've destroyed. We have to grind it up back into the ground. That's the only choice we have and hope for a better day.
Paul Allen isn't alone. Farmers across the country are just
starting to make their way to China after the president's deal with Xi Jinping. But farmers in the Midwest say the new revenue stream is not enough to make up for losses from the trade war. CBS News correspondent Lana Zak is in Iowa and has been following this story for us all year. So, Lana, let's talk about how much are Chinese buyers actually taking in?
Well, so they have spent his entire life farming in Arkansas.
I still learn something new every day.
Corn, rice, and soybeans.
That's what a U.S. soybean should look like.
Yellow is perfect. Soybeans are one of the most valuable U.S. agriculture exports. From human food to the oil used to make a Goodyear tire, this tiny plant is mighty. And American soybean farmers say they're in the middle of a massive growing crisis.
When that is full, there should be 650 bushel at a $10.
We just want to work, sell our crop, and have a decent life like everybody else. But if they would just leave it alone.
This trade war is going to impact literally every corner of the country. Some of those who are most uncertain about what this is going to mean is those in agriculture and farming. Like here, corn and soybean farmers and pork producers. Where does this trade war end?
I don't know where it ends. I hope it ends soon.
What is your message to the Trump administration?
Just stay out of it.
I put out a statement today about farmers. Our farmers are being hurt badly by, they have very good workers. They've worked for them for 20 years. They're not citizens, but they've turned out to be, great. And we're going to have to do something about that. We can't take farmers and take all their people and send them back because they don't have maybe what they're supposed to have, maybe not. And you know what's going to happen and what is happening? They get rid of some of the people because, you go into a farm and you look and people they've been there for 20, 25 years and they've worked great and the owner of the farm loves them and everything else. And then you're supposed to throw them out. And you know what happens? They end up hiring the people, the criminals that have come in, the murderers from prisons and everything else. So we're going to have an order on that pretty soon, I think. We can't do that to our farmers. And leisure, too, hotels. We're going to have to use a lot of common sense on that.
Are you angry?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm totally mad. There's no reason for it. This is absolute stupidity. This is a man-made crisis caused by Donald Trump, period.
John Bartman is a soybean farmer whose family has been working Illinois land since before the Civil War. This year, his crops, diligently planted, meticulously cared for, are losing their value.
This is a yield monitor. This allows me to see instantly what my yield is doing. So this is 4,000.
The announcement came like a thunderclap that rolled across continents, unsettling markets and shaking diplomatic circles from Washington to Beijing. Africa had just declared the cancellation of a $200 billion farm import deal with the United States, a trade arrangement that had once symbolized the depth of economic ties between the two regions. But this time the tone was different. This was not just about food. It was about power, independence, and the tectonic shifts in global geopolitics. For decades, Africa had been a cornerstone of the U.S. agricultural export machine, a key destination for surplus American grains, soybeans, wheat, and processed foods. Behind the facade of partnership, however, lay deep structural inequality. U.S. agricultural policy was rooted in massive subsidies that made its exports cheaper than local produce in African markets. African farmers could not compete. Their own food industries withered, their farmlands underutilized, and dependency deepened. The $200 billion deal, celebrated in Washington as a symbol of mutual growth, was in reality an instrument of control, a quiet mechanism to maintain influence over Africa's food security and trade policies. But the world was changing. The pandemic had exposed the fragility of global supply chains. The war in Eastern Europe had sent shockwaves through food markets, driving up prices and forcing African leaders to rethink the vulnerability of relying on Western suppliers. At the same time, new trade corridors were opening between Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The balance of power was shifting, and Africa's leaders saw an opportunity to seize it. In early 2025, after months of internal discussions within the African Union's Economic Committee, the decision was made. The deal would not be renewed. The continent would instead invest the same $200 billion into building its own agricultural and food processing infrastructure, powered by regional cooperation and foreign partnerships on fairer terms. It was a bold, calculated geopolitical maneuver, one that would immediately ripple across global markets. Within hours of the announcement, the Chicago Board of Trade saw a sharp collapse in commodity futures. Wheat, corn, and soybean prices tumbled. Investors panicked. Major U.S. agribusiness firms saw billions wiped from their valuations. The ripple effect hit Wall Street, then the dollar. Washington's policymakers were blindsided. A crisis meeting was called at the Treasury and State Department. How could Africa, long considered the recipient of American agricultural benevolence, turn its back so decisively? The answer was rooted in geopolitics as much as economics. Africa was no longer the periphery of global trade, it was becoming a new center of influence. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, launched just a few years earlier, had begun to take shape, integrating markets and harmonizing regulations. Regional food industries were springing up, supported by technology transfers. From China and India, Middle Eastern investors were funding massive irrigation projects, while African governments pushed for modernization of storage, logistics, and value chains. Africa was no longer asking for aid, it was demanding equality. This development marked a direct challenge to the post-World War II economic order, in which the United States had dominated through both its financial and agricultural clout. By controlling food exports, Washington controlled leverage. It could dictate terms in aid negotiations, trade deals, and even political alignments. African leaders had seen how countries dependent on U.S. grain supplies were often forced to toe Washington's diplomatic line. Now, by canceling the farm deal, Africa had effectively declared itself independent of that leverage. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. In the American Midwest, millions of tons of grain were suddenly without a market. Silos filled up, prices plummeted, and farmers faced the worst crisis since the 1980s farm collapse. The government scrambled to announce emergency subsidies, but they were mere bandages on a bleeding wound. Rural economies that had once been stable thanks to African export markets were now teetering. Agribusiness lobbies demanded intervention, while think tanks warned of the end of U.S. agricultural hegemony. Meanwhile, in Africa, the mood was electric. The cancellation was framed not as retaliation, but as liberation. Governments announced that the billions once used to import food would instead fund intra-African trade and regional food independence programs. China, India, and Brazil quickly offered partnerships not in exporting goods, but in co-developing technologies for fertilizer production, mechanized farming, and seed engineering. The geopolitical symbolism was unmistakable. Africa was pivoting away from Western dependence toward a multipolar alliance that favored cooperation over control. From an economic standpoint, Africa's move also reflected strategic foresight. Global demand for food was surging, and the continent held 60% of the world's arable land. For decades, it had exported raw materials while importing processed goods, a pattern that kept it trapped in a cycle of dependency. Now leaders envisioned a vertically integrated agricultural model: grow, process, and export from within Africa. Instead of shipping unprocessed cocoa or coffee abroad, African factories would produce chocolate, roasted coffee, and packaged foods ready for global markets. The decision to cancel the $200 billion deal was the first brick in that foundation. In Washington, officials understood what was truly at stake. This wasn't merely a trade dispute, it was an erosion of soft power. Agriculture had always been one of America's greatest diplomatic tools. Food aid programs, subsidized grain exports, and trade incentives had allowed the U.S. to maintain influence in developing nations. Africa's defiance signaled the unraveling of that system. If other regions followed suit, if Latin America, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East also turned toward self-sufficiency, America's global leverage would crumble. Economists began calling it the new food nationalism. Across Africa, countries were enacting laws to protect domestic production, restrict cheap imports, and prioritize local processing. Pan-African institutions were being created to manage food reserves, stabilize prices, and provide emergency grain supplies, tasks once outsourced to the West. For the first time in history, Africa was constructing a continental food security framework independent of Washington's oversight. The geopolitical implications extended far beyond trade. As Africa's reliance on the U.S. waned, its strategic partnerships diversified. In return for agricultural collaboration, African nations gained access to Chinese-built infrastructure, railways, ports, and energy grids that connected remote farmlands to export terminals. Middle Eastern sovereign funds began buying stakes in African agribusiness cooperatives. Europe, caught between its own energy crisis and food insecurity, had no choice but to court Africa for imports. The once passive continent had transformed into a geoeconomic power broker. Behind closed doors, Washington analysts debated how to respond. Retaliation through sanctions or tariffs was risky, it would only push Africa further into the arms of its eastern partners. Attempts to renegotiate failed as African leaders stood united. One diplomat reportedly summed it up: "For the first time, we are trading on our own terms." As the months unfolded, the shift began to manifest across the global economy. The dollar's dominance in food trade contracts weakened as more transactions were conducted in yuan, dirham, and local African currencies. The International Monetary Fund warned of unprecedented realignments in agricultural capital flows. Western media, once dismissive of Africa's economic potential, now ran headlines like "Africa's food independence movement reshapes global trade." In the end, the $200 billion cancellation symbolized something far greater than an economic decision. It was a geopolitical awakening. Africa had recognized its strategic value, not as a passive consumer, but as a vital player in the global food supply chain. It was asserting control over the very resource that sustains civilization, food. For the United States, it was a sobering lesson in the limits of power. Economic dominance could no longer be sustained through control, not in a world where alliances were shifting and developing nations were reclaiming their agency. Africa had spoken, and the world was listening. What began as an agricultural decision had evolved into a declaration of a new world order, one where sovereignty, self-reliance, and balanced partnership replaced dependency and control. Word count, 1015. The weeks following Africa's $200 billion farm deal cancellation plunged the global economy into a state of turbulence not seen since the oil shocks of the 1970s. In Washington, policymakers scrambled to understand the full scope of what had just happened, but it was already too late. The move had not only crippled America's agricultural exports but had also exposed a deep vulnerability in the very structure of its economy, the illusion of permanent dominance in global trade. While American television networks tried to portray the event as an impulsive political gesture by African leaders, the truth ran far deeper. The decision had been the product of years of quiet coordination across African capitals, months of data analysis, and strategic consultations with non-Western partners. This was not rebellion. For its own sake, it was the birth of a new economic consciousness across the continent. At the center of the transformation was a question of sovereignty. For decades, Africa's food imports from the United States had been sold under the banner of development partnership. In reality, it was dependency disguised as aid. By importing massive quantities of cheap, subsidized grain and processed foods, African nations had unintentionally undermined their local producers. Farmers were abandoning their lands because they could not compete with imported products whose prices were artificially deflated by U.S. subsidies. Local industries collapsed and agricultural jobs disappeared. The cancellation of the $200 billion deal was, therefore, a collective act of economic defiance, a declaration that Africa would no longer participate in a trade system that extracted value while offering little in return. But it was also a carefully calculated geopolitical move designed to shift the continent's alliances toward partners who viewed Africa as a collaborator, not a customer. In Beijing, New Delhi, and Riyadh, the news was received with enthusiasm. China's Ministry of Commerce immediately proposed a $30 billion African Food Technology Fund, offering machinery, drone-assisted irrigation systems, and AI-based crop management platforms to modernize African agriculture. India followed with a program to provide affordable fertilizers and organic seed technology. The Gulf nations, especially the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, saw an opportunity to secure their food futures by investing directly in Africa's farmland and cold chain logistics. Within 6 months, Africa's agricultural landscape began to change. Large-scale projects were launched across East, West, and Southern Africa. Satellite-based soil monitoring guided crop rotations, solar-powered irrigation systems were installed, and regional agro-industrial hubs began to rise in places once considered economically stagnant. The symbolism was unmistakable. Africa was using its own land and resources to feed itself and the world. The move was not just economic. It was geopolitical theater at its finest. Africa was demonstrating to the world that it was no longer the dependent actor in the global trade narrative. The continent's leaders had realized that food was not merely a commodity, it was a tool of power, influence, and sovereignty. In reclaiming control over their agricultural systems, they were reclaiming political freedom. In the United States, the repercussions were devastating. Major agricultural conglomerates, heavily dependent on African markets, reported massive quarterly losses. Corn exports dropped by 40%, soybean exports by 55%, and wheat shipments by almost 70%. The government rushed to implement bailouts to keep farmers afloat, but even that proved insufficient. Entire towns in the Midwest, built on generations of agricultural trade, found themselves facing bankruptcy. Storage facilities overflowed with unsold grain. Prices fell so low that some farmers destroyed crops rather than harvest them. Economists at major think tanks began publishing alarming reports. The United States, they warned, had become dangerously overexposed to global markets it no longer controlled. The trade patterns that had once ensured its dominance were now turning against it. The rest of the world was decoupling, moving away from dependence on the US dollar and its subsidized exports. Africa's decision to pivot toward regional self-sufficiency and trade with emerging powers was accelerating this realignment. Meanwhile, Africa's regional blocs ECOWAS, the East African Community, and SADC took swift action to integrate their agricultural policies under the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFTA). New frameworks were established to reduce tariffs on intra-African food trade and streamline cross-border logistics. Roads and railway corridors were being upgraded to connect farming regions with ports and processing plants. The dream of a unified African food market, once dismissed as idealistic, was becoming a tangible reality. Beyond the economics, there was a psychological shift taking place across the continent. For generations, African nations had been told that they needed Western aid to feed themselves. Now that narrative was crumbling. National media across Africa celebrated the decision as the great agricultural reawakening. Farmers who had once struggled to survive were suddenly in high demand, their produce valued as part of a new continental strategy. Agricultural universities began partnering with Asian and South American institutions to train the next generation of agronomists, engineers, and supply chain specialists as Africa's agricultural independence grew. Its geopolitical voice strengthened. At international summits, African leaders began to speak more assertively about food sovereignty, calling for global trade rules that favored fair competition over subsidized dumping. Their stance resonated with nations in the global south that had faced similar challenges. What started as an African movement was evolving into a global coalition of countries demanding reform in the way agricultural trade was structured. The United States attempted diplomatic outreach. A series of envoys traveled to African capitals, offering revised trade terms and promising new investment incentives. But the damage had been done. Trust was broken. African nations were no longer willing to negotiate under frameworks dictated by Washington. They sought partnerships based on technology sharing, not aid. Infrastructure development, not dependency. The U.S., accustomed to leading, now found itself pleading. From a geopolitical perspective, analysts began describing Africa's farm deal cancellation as the grain shock. Much like the oil embargoes of the 1970s had forced Western nations to recognize their energy vulnerabilities. This agricultural shift exposed America's food export dependence. The world's largest economy had assumed that its dominance in food production made it irreplaceable. Africa's defiance proved otherwise. The dollar, too, began to feel the strain. As African trade with Asia and the Middle East expanded, transactions were increasingly conducted in yuan, rupees, and dirhams. The symbolic power of the U.S. currency, once the bedrock of global trade, began to erode. For the first time in history, food trade agreements were being denominated. Outside the dollar system, Washington's influence over commodity pricing and global food logistics was slipping. Inside Africa, the story was different. Rural communities that had once been poor and neglected were experiencing new levels of prosperity. Local manufacturing plants processed fruits, grains, and vegetables for export to regional and Asian markets. Employment surged. Governments, empowered by rising revenues, began investing in healthcare, education, and green energy. The narrative of Africa as a recipient of global generosity was rapidly transforming into one of a rising power shaping global supply chains. At the same time, environmental sustainability became a central pillar of this new agricultural revolution. Unlike the monoculture systems pushed by industrialized nations, Africa's farming reforms emphasized ecological balance, crop diversity, soil regeneration, and renewable irrigation. With climate change threatening food systems worldwide, Africa's model was being hailed as the future of global agriculture in think tanks and policy rooms across Washington. The mood was grim. The realization had dawned that this was not just a trade disruption, it was a structural shift in the global order. The world was no longer revolving around the Western economic axis. Africa, once seen as a market to be exploited, had become a strategic player in rewriting the rules of international trade. What stung the most for Washington was not merely the economic loss, but the symbolism. The very continent once labeled as developing had demonstrated the foresight and unity to overturn one of the most enduring hierarchies of the modern era. Africa was no longer waiting for permission to rise. It was doing so on its own terms. By the end of the first year after the cancellation, the U.S. agricultural economy had not recovered. Global headlines told the story succinctly. Africa feeds itself and the world watches in awe. The old order was gone, and a new one was taking shape, one that no longer centered around the West,